Robert. Robert's a senior zoologist for the New Jersey Department of Fish and Wildlife Endangered and Non-Game Species Program. He's been doing this since 2007, so he probably knows every species personally by now. Nearly 20 years of dedication to the Pinelands, biodiversity, and insect conservation. His focus has been on butterflies, dragonflies, and freshwater mussels, although tonight I think we're going to hear a lot about bees. He also focuses on tigerflies, which I didn't know what they were, fireflies, and he'll also tell us about the pollinator plant kits that the state grows that we might be able to participate in. So, Robert, take it over. I'm going to say goodbye. It's all yours.
Sounds good. I think you probably meant tiger beetles. We do
Oh,
tiger
tiger
beetle work.
beetles. I wrote
Uh,
down the wrong thing. Thank you.
it's all good.
No wonder I was
Um,
confused.
Tiger fly would be interesting though. I'm gonna share my screen. You can hear me. Hopefully everybody else can hear me as well. Um, do a little introduction and then kind of go into presentation and things like that. So once again, I work for Department of Environmental Protection, Fish and Wildlife, the Endangered Nongame Species Program. Many people don't realize the work that we do as Fish and Wildlife as an agency because so much of it's like centered on hunting and fishing and things like that, which is a huge part of our agency. But then we have an endangered and non species program that is responsible for all the conservation work for all of the rare and endangered wildlife in the state of New Jersey and listed species, species of greatest conservation need. And that ranges from things like bald eagles to bobcats all the way down to like the invertebrate community where all of my research and work is focused on. Um, Slide, it's not advancing. There we go. Sorry about that. My arrows were not working. Introduction cover most of this. I've got my bachelor's of science degree from Stockton University, environmental studies, a minor in biology, and then I have a master's degree from Rutgers University, ecology and evolution. And when it comes to my background, I was trained mostly as a forest ecologist and ecosystems type person. I've always focused on systems, not really so focused on individual species, and very focused things, but always had an interest in insects and insect conservation. So when I started my career with the state, they were lacking anybody to focus on like some of our listed butterflies and dragonflies and other species. So that was kind of the role I kind of shifted right into. And as has gone on, we've expanded to other species groups, like Bobby kind of mentioned at the very beginning of all this. Um, we're starting to do more just in the last 2 years, firefly work. We did a lot of bee kind of work in like the last 5 to 10 years because for so many of these things, like we know what our rare butterflies are, we know what our rare dragonflies are. We have lists for those species. Bees, we didn't even have a list of what bees existed in New Jersey. And then when we generate a list of what bees are here, well, which ones are rare, which ones are endangered, like, and why are they rare, things like that. So it's kind of like some of those problems we've been working to solve as time goes on. Um, my talk, I'll kind of go over some bee biodiversity stuff and then kind of delve into some of the habitat work and projects I do and I'm involved with, and then kind of tie into like some of the things that people can do, members of the public can do, and some partner kind of project ideas that kind of like have been part of this conversation we've been having with coming to do this talk. Um, kind of preaching to the choir on so many of these things, I would hope. Pollinating insects are suffering, massive population declines with a whole host of other species, like biodiversity collapse, the loss of was it a billion birds loss and things like that. Butterflies, insects, and the same thing. Like I've worked for the state for 20 years and watched the decline of many species, and there's quite a few species I've worked on that are now extirpated, that I've watched disappear for any number of reasons, and then sometimes for like unknown reasons. And kind of mentioned at the beginning, like knowing all these in depth, and it's like I know a lot, but there's a monumental amount that I don't know. And it's like the more I learn, the more questions I have. And when it comes to the natural world, there's so much we don't know or understand that we're really only kind of touching the tip of the iceberg of what so many species need. And so many circumstances not clear cut what we need to do from a conservation point of view. Um, Variety of problems we all face, like we talked about the invasive species bill that passed for invasive plants. One of the biggest problems most of my like listed butterflies face is invasive plants. Like that is impacting so many species. It's just, staggering. I really always include this slide to talk about because it always comes up, and many people don't realize that the honeybee is not native. It's a introduced kind of species, is an agriculturally domesticated bee, but it is important. Agriculture, it does play a big role in farming and things like that, but it has other impacts on like native pollinators and bees. Um, it's not like overly efficient as a pollinator for a lot of different plants. It's like the reason there's 300 some species of bees in New Jersey because there's several thousand species of plants or whatever it might be. And so many of them have unique flowers, unique shapes that depend on a unique bee to pollinate them. A single pollinator and a honeybee cannot do that efficiently for everything. But it is part of the story because they can benefit from pollinator habitat projects. They can benefit, especially if you're like you apiarist and keep bees at home, having good pollinator meadows and food sources for your bees goes on to making them healthy. I always like to touch on it that it's an interesting species, but not what we're talking about here today. Like what we're going to try and touch on is all of our native bees, of which there's a huge diversity. And I kind of have to always give out credit where credit's due. Like a big part of the success of this project has been able to work with Dr. Rachel Winfrey at Rutgers University at the Cook campus in New Brunswick and her lab. They have an extensive bee kind of research and conservation program that does research like all over the Northeastern United States. I was just emailing her today about coordinating some project work. And we're lucky to have that lab in the state, and we've worked together on several kind of grants and projects to help work through this bee question of, I know the 120 some odd butterflies in New Jersey, of which 28 are listed. I know all those pretty well, but what happens when started asking pollinator questions and like, I don't really know bees. I need to learn more and started working together with them. So we'll touch off with New Jersey's native bees, kind of like a quick tour through them. Bees are kind of fascinating. They've been around for the last 100 million years. There's a picture of one in amber. I always like to kind of think about things from like an evolutionary point of view of like, certain things that evolution got right. And, the evolution of bees and flowering plants and things like that has been around for 100 million years. And like, it's interesting in that they've not changed very much in all that time. Think of how many things have changed. Like, human beings have only evolved for the last million or some odd years, and only modern humans in a lot more recent time. Um, so it's kind of fun to think about that. And one thing people don't know too is like New Jersey is like one of the sources for like the most amber and insect specimens and early flower specimens like in the world. And it's from some of the old clay pits like in like the Sayreville area and things like that, where there was a lot of research done like 20 to 30 years ago on some of the amber deposits there. And tons of bees and insect specimens came from New Jersey, and they're in the Museum of Natural History. So kind of a fun little point. Getting into like, details and things like that, thousands and thousands of species of bees, of which in New Jersey, we've got about 320. When we did a lot of like digging, a lot of data analysis and things like that, is trying to like get a handle on, well, how many bees are in New Jersey? Like, just a simple enough question. And like, we didn't really know. So we worked together with Rutgers to kind of answer that question. And that number changes. Like, and it has been changing even recently as taxonomy changes or new research happens or new species are discovered. Or like there was one or two species we dropped off that list because they were always presumed to have been native. And then more research realized, no, they were introduced. They just were introduced so long ago that people presumed them to be native because by the time people started paying attention to bees, these bees were here. They just assumed they're a native bee. And then, modern kind of genetic research and some other stuff that was done is like, well, those two or three shouldn't be on your list. They're native to Europe. And we didn't know they were here back then. And even kind of getting into that, only about 10 are bumblebees in New Jersey, which are the more familiar bees for people to know. So, 310 some species of bees are like all the other different types, shapes, sizes of native bees. And the vast majority of them are all solitary. With some of our work, we kind of were, our programs, endangered non-native species programs, we work on rare and endangered species, was trying to kind of statistically narrow down, well, what are 120, what are our rare bees? You know, can we answer that question? And even if they are rare, well, why are they rare? Like, are they on the edge of range? Are they kind of some kind of habitat specialist or things like that? And then for many of them, we don't know. Like there's of the 300 some species on that list, like the vast majority, we still really don't know very much about them, other than the fact that we can have a name, we can identify it as a specimen. But beyond that, we know very little about their life history. So that's what a lot of the research Rutgers is doing, is starting to kind of tease these things out. It does create a huge problem. Most of these species cannot be field ID'd. And I can tell you, like, with being naive and going into Rutgers and like my experience of like, I can field ID butterflies. I can net a dragonfly idea. I can photograph a dragonfly idea. I can ID an awful lot of things in the field. And going into there, it's like, well, how do we go about like, IDing these bees in the field? And it was pretty much, you don't. So it's like, a learning curve. It's getting better now. A lot of information is available. A lot of keys are available online. Some bumblebees and some species are more conducive to it than others. But a lot of it involves a lot of lab work, a lot of lab time, specimen collection and management. Rutgers, I think, has 30 some thousand specimens, I believe, and growing of bees in their lab. And part of that research was working together with them of going through all those bees, double checking taxonomy, generating a list from it, and then putting that information on a map and something useful to us as an agency. Um, Pollinators is always a term that's very broadly used to lump a lot of stuff together. It's easy to lump things together, but like you wouldn't manage for a deer and a squirrel in the same way. They have different life histories or different sizes. Like the size range between different species of bees is like on that kind of scale between some of the biggest bumblebees and the smallest like sweat bees and things like that. They're monumentally different from each other. You have a colonial, insect to a solitary insect. They may depend on entirely different plants, different life histories, different flight windows. So it's like it makes it complex because a lot of people think, oh, we're going to do pollinator conservation. It's like it's not that easy. Absolutely beautiful organisms, the metallic greens and blues, a lot of variation there. They're a lot of fun to work with. Some of them too, when it comes to some of the solitary species, you always think of the bumbus bees being really big and then your stereotypical kind of sweat bees and mason bees being relatively small. But there's some of like the halictus, ones and some of the other species that are like fairly large on the size of like a bumblebee and things like that. This halictus is, almost the size of like, your largest bumblebees that you can find. Um, Quick touching on life history and like once again like the complexities and conservation work. Most of these have a very small flight window. Most of them are like linked to certain types of flowering plants. They only fly when the flowers are in bloom. Like anything, there's generalists and specialists. So you have generalists that have out all season long. But most of the solitary ones and most of the 300 some species have very narrow flight windows and very focused habitats. So it presents challenges from a conservation point of view because they're hard to survey for and find. You got to be there at the right time in the right place. And then you've got to be able to get them and identify them. And one thing I always point out to people from a conservation point of view too is like we get into like when we're doing projects and habitat management, other things like that. We're like, we can have a timing restriction. We can have something else to like prevent harm to some animal because we don't really have like habitat protections. Our legal protections are based on not harming the individual animal. So like, well, we just time it when the bird migrates away or they're hibernating. But like when it comes to insects, they're always present in the environment in some way, shape, or form, whether it be an egg, a larvae, a pupa, or an adult. So it's like it's one of those things to think about from a management point of view. Bumblebees are like, social, have colonies and things like that. Approximately 45 species in the U.S. We have about 10 in New Jersey. They've been facing a lot of declines along with any variety of other things. Just quick, life history on bumblebees. Like, they overwinter as the female, like in the winter, and that's where like leaves and cover, leave your leaves and things like that come into play. Like, there's a whole lot of insects that spend winter as an adult and emerge next spring as an adult to then start their life cycle over again. Even some butterflies, like your mourning cloak, one of the first ones you see on a sunny day in spring, because it's overwintered as an adult. Um, just touching on the habitats and things like that, very diverse. You can have some of your mining bees and mason bees that need stems or just tiny little bare patches of soil to dig a tunnel in. That is all it needs. Whereas like a bumblebee is going to need some kind of cover or structure, whether it be the root mat of some bunch grass or an old nest or someplace else that it can build. Like the habitat needs vary greatly. One thing that's interesting too, and it doesn't come into play with like the bumblebees we have in New Jersey. We only have so many species, but when we get out west in the Rockies, some other places where there's a lot more species, a lot of the resource partitioning is kind of based on like the tongue length and shape and things like that. And only a bumblebee with like a certain length tongue is able to get into some of these flowers. And this is a picture of a bearberry down in Ocean County, New Jersey, with a bumblebee. But you can see his tongue kind of extended into this tiny little flower. So the only way to pollinate that little flower is either A, you're a tiny, tiny little bee that can get in there, or B, that's willing to chew a hole in the side of the flower and then get into there. Or, you got to be B, have like the right shape and length tongue to be able to kind of pollinate that flower. Um, Fun thing to kind of always talk about and touch on with all those species and all the diversity is like everybody knows what a cuckoo bird is, and everybody kind of knows what like a nest parasite is, like a cowbird or a red-headed duck. There's a whole variety of cuckoo bees that are all native species, and they're nest parasites, but they're not nest parasites in the sense that they don't consume the larvae of the host that they're parasitizing. What they do is they go in and lay an egg in the nest of some other bee species, and they lay the egg on to like the nectar or whatever food that bee species is feeding its larvae, and then their young consumes it. I mean, it is negative to the young that would have normally been consuming it, but they're not like a parasite in the sense that they're parasitizing the larvae of the other bees. They're actually being fed by the other bees because they feed on the food source of that bee. And many of the cuckoo bees are very host specific. They're linked to certain bees. I believe there was two different species of cuckoo bees that were directly linked to Bombus affinis, a rusty patch bumblebee that's been in the news a lot and having declines. And the moment their host bee went away, the cuckoo bees went away too because they no longer had the host. So getting into like answering these questions, solving these problems, Rutgers has an extensive collection of bees taken from all over the state of New Jersey. So we started looking at that, looking at it on the map and saying, like there's always sample bias when you get into research. Like, so most of their bee sampling is biased to farms or doing research, agriculture research, things like that. So it's not surprising there. So how do we kind of spread some kind of random sampled survey effort to other places of the state and other habitats to try and capture some of these other bees? So, part of the big project we had together with them was working with their lab to target other habitat types, kind of fill in gaps on the map and see how much information we can add to kind of creating a bee list for New Jersey. And what happens because of having so many bees, so many habitat types, there's a lot of places to look, and we've probably not looked everywhere, and there's probably more things to be discovered out there. And, from us, from a conservation point of view, at the end of the day, the information I'm looking to glean from this is if I'm going to do a forestry project someplace, monitoring before management. I'd like to know what organisms are there, trying to positively benefit them and not negatively, impact other things. So trying to say, hey, like we know this bee is rare. We know that its habitat is oddly, specific to, pine plains and the pygmy forest of Warren Grove, and they're growing up because of lack of fire. It'd be nice to have that bee and the information on what it needs to be able to put on a map and say, hey, when we go to do some work and habitat work on our state property, let's make sure we include that bee in the conversation because it's something that should be on our radar. There's a lot of like the bigger species that we work for, but we're trying to incorporate a lot of these insects and things like that. Because at the end of the day, like we're trying to do the best job we can from like a land management, like a land manager and practicing conservation. And there's an awful lot of biodiversity out there that we want to always give attention to. Um, so as we go through like the journey of like our bees and rare bees and things like that, and teasing through data and trying to get information, New Jersey has its own endemic bee, Calides bradleyi. It's only found in New Jersey, nowhere else in the universe. And it's interesting, the original specimen collections, I believe, from like the 1920s, 30s, like they were pretty old, like American Museum of Natural History stuff. So they kind of knew of the species, but it hadn't been seen again until this research project with Rutgers, where they found them again. And now they've been doing some more research and surveys. Some more occurrences have been coming up for this species, which is kind of interesting. But once again, it's like an endemic species in New Jersey, not found anywhere else. So this is good information to know. Like we'd hate to go do a project someplace that was important to this bee and inadvertently cause it harm. Um, Getting to some other like more interesting kind of bees and diversity. Another really, really rare one that's in New Jersey is Rhodocii. It's a cuckoo bee parasite of Andrena bees, but it's a cranberry specialist. So it's only found in the pine barrens of South Jersey. Some other ones that like, get into life histories and diversity and things like that, and just kind of there's 300 some bees. I only kind of highlight some like real kind of like ones to talk about that are interesting is this species of bee is what is, I always mispronounce the term, but it's oligolectic, in that they're not like a nectar feeding kind of species like so many other bees. They actually collect oil from plants. So as you kind of go through all these different bees, there's a lot of diversity in how they build nests, where they need to build nests, and even in what food resources they choose, because some of them are not necessarily a pollen or nectar thing. You have some species that are dependent on different types of plant oils. Some species that are really important are some of the smallest species. And you think about, why would a small bee be so important, compared to like a honeybee or something else like that? And they're just large numbers of them, a lot of diversity, large numbers of individuals and things like that. So they become very important as pollinators in that, like, when it comes to like honeybees and beehives, there's a finite amount of like those bees in that hive, and there's a finite amount of geographic area they can cover. But when you have like good functioning ecosystems surrounding like kind of farm areas and things like that, with literally 100 to 200 maybe species of native bees in a given area and thousands of individuals, all of a sudden all those tiny little bees start to make a really big difference. And that's one of the highlight points of some of Rutgers' research over time is like, you have some of these farms, there's 20, 30 or more species of bees that are doing pollination on a farm. Um, some other interesting species that like, people probably heard of and think they have interesting adaptations are like the leaf cutter bees, and you sometimes might see these distinctive little holes cut into leaves and things like that. And some bees just dig a hole in the ground and then use that for the structure of the nest. Other ones are lining that hole or feature with like plant materials and things. And then I think there was some relatively recent research looking at different types of bees that cut leaf holes to promote flowering and things like that, because it stresses the plant and then promotes further flowering on it, which is kind of like another just interesting facet to like bee diversity. And the interesting thing with these is like, the adaptations, you get to the different adaptations on like their legs and things for pollen carrying structures and things like that, from cups to furs and, fur and guard hairs and various things that are designed around transporting pollen. There's a lot of diversity in those structures, but there's also a lot of diversity in mouthpieces depending on what the bee is doing for its life history. These species having like special like cutting tips, to their jaws to be able to saw these pieces of leaves off. Um, some species are dependent on scraping up plant fibers. So you have some that are cutting leaves, some that are grabbing oil, and some that are actually stripping and collecting plant fibers for their nests and things like that. So a variety, you think about the flower aspect of the bee's life history for the nectar and pollen, but then there's like a whole nother world of like the nest structures and needs for all these bees. Like if the flowering plants don't provide the nest structures, it's only providing part of the needs of the bee. And it gets, and that kind of plays into what kind of habitat you're creating, whether in your garden or somewhere else. Everybody's familiar with the carpenter bee, the big, it's like the biggest one that you see around your barns and your house and things like that. Try not to lose my voice. But there's dozens of smaller carpenter bees that, have the same kind of lifestyle, except they drill tiny little holes into logs and structures and things like that. Um, Even though, a lot of people think of them as a pest, they're another one of our native insects that is part of our, landscape around. Um, Kind of some of the interesting things that we really started to tease out with this project was trying to, determine once again rare bees versus common bees, generalist versus specialist bees. And the specialist bees fall into like a several kind of broad categories. Cranberries and blueberries, like there's a lot of like, South Jersey pine barrens kind of stereotypical like specialist bees linked to those plants and those ecosystems. Dogwoods and willows, like once again, like one of your other talks are going to be trees and shrubs. It's interesting, like the first four of these mentioned here are various types of trees, shrubs, vines, and other things that are different than like your standard flowering plants. And each one of them has like, you know, rare or uncommon bee species that feed upon them or depend on them. Spring wildflowers, another big one. You got a small window in spring with these wildflowers are in bloom, and then there's populations of bees that are only active when those flowers are in bloom. Um, One thing that we've not done much research on, but is coming up more in the conversation, it kind of goes into the invasive species kind of side of things. There's quite a few non-native bees, and we've got a ballpark of about 20 of them, like that we know of in New Jersey, but they're poorly studied or understood. But they can be found to be competitive with native bees, particularly for nest structures, like so many invasive species. They're really good at what they do, and they can outcompete the natives. The same thing when it comes just even to honeybees. They're not native, but they can like outcompete native bees because they're just bigger and more aggressive for like pollen and nectar resources. Um, with all these different types of bee species, there's a big diversity of what is bee habitat. We recently were like working on some of our regional species of greatest conservation needs list, and a lot of bees that were coming out are found in other places. So I always kind of pitch like, what is good pollinator? What is good pollinator habitat? What should it look like? And it's like a lot of people will think like something like this is like, wow, that looks really good. A lot of flowers. Other than the fact that it's 100% cosmos and nothing else, and in the median of a road. These are kind of popular things to do because they're easy and relatively cheap and they're highly visible, but it doesn't really provide much diversity of habitat and structure. Um, I always throw this out there too because a lot of these, what's good like bee kind of pollinator habitat is good functioning native kind of grassland habitats. And that's why a lot of times you'll see good like pollinator seed mixes are like 60, 70% grass, with the balance being forbs and flower, your forbs and flowering plants. But these are like the backbone of the habitat. These provide the nesting structure. What you really want is like that mix of like native grasslands and meadows, native grasses, to provide like nesting structures and like stability during the winter and the other seasons when the flowering plants, aren't in bloom and they tend not to be as sturdy and last as long. Other places where there are rare bees, there are rare coastal dune specialist bees. There are rare coastal dune specialist fireflies. There are tiger beetles as well. There's a whole host of insects found in like these coastal beaches and dunes that we often don't think about. In southern New Jersey, there's actually one of the bee species that's entirely dependent on Spartina, salt marsh cordgrass. Spartina alterniflora is, I think, the sororities is the big one, alterniflora the little one. Either way, it only nests in the stems of salt marsh cordgrass, the big cordgrass. So when you do survey work, you're finding the bee in the surrounding uplands, but they only nest in the nearby salt marshes. So it's only like a kind of southern New Jersey coastal plain thing, but the nesting habitat is critically dependent on the salt marsh plant and then nectarine and surrounding habitats. There's a researcher from Rutgers working just on pickerelweed specialist bees in the Pine Barrens the other summer, of which there are several species that are, dependent on pickerelweed. I always throws out there too is like, what's pollinator habitat? Does this look like pollinator habitat to most people? Probably not. But the whole understory of like a lot of forests in South Jersey are low bush blueberry, huckleberry, big bush blueberry, and things like that, with a whole host of bees that are pollinating them in the spring when it is flowering. North Jersey, same story as South Jersey, with a lot of your spring ephemeral wildflowers and things like that, and the bees that depend upon them. So you look at some of these forest areas, and there's a lot of research. Rutgers has had one of their postdocs just working on forest bees because, a lot of times we're thinking about pollinator habitat, we're thinking fields and meadows when we should be, making sure we're not forgetting about the bees of the forest. Um, there's a whole list of other insects that work on pollination. I have a friend of mine who very much specializes in tumbling beetles and pollinating beetles and things like that, and that's his kind of forte. Butterflies and moths are also pollinators, various species of beetles. Flies, particularly like the syrphid flies and hover flies that you see. Wasps, and then you get like hummingbirds and bats in other parts of the world. Whole host of butterflies. Like I said, there's 120 some odd butterflies in New Jersey. About 28 of them are listed species that are rare and endangered. This is just a snapshot of four of our rare ones, and all important in these ecosystems. When it comes to like other pollinating insects, you often have some of like the day flying moths and things like that, like Atlantis moths and clearwing sphinx moths, and some of the other species that are day flying moths that are often mistaken for butterflies. Wasps and syrphid flies also important pollinators, and oftentimes, they may be important pollinators for some things that maybe bees aren't. Um, Getting into why we're having this conversation while we're talking about it. And I always kind of like use the rusty patch bumblebee decline as like a good kind of talking point. Um, it's federally petitioned for listing. I'm trying to now I'm blanking out. I think it was listed. Um, yes, it was listed. Um, it used to be a common bee in New Jersey. I've talked to Rutgers, talked to a lot of researchers. Like through the 1990s into the early 2000s, like there were places that this was the most common bee to be found when Rutgers was doing surveys and other people doing research. And one of those, species that collapsed like pretty much catastrophically, probably from a foreign pathogen. The best research and knowledge is based on like some pathogens that were brought in from Europe through like farmed bumblebees and greenhouse agriculture and things like that. And like, any kind of pandemic or any kind of disease or any kind of invasive thing, pretty much a rapid collapse. And the problem with insects is only so many people are paying attention to them. They're small and they don't last on the environment. Like you have like an EHD outbreak in deer. It's obvious really quick that there are a lot of deer around. That's obvious. You notice that. A whole lot of bees just wink out like one year, like all of a sudden the next year, just kind of looking around. Well, why didn't they come back? Where'd they go? So that's what kind of triggered a lot of this. Why we do this kind of work, why is it important? Hopefully preaching to the choir, biodiversity, conservation, like it all matters. It's all part of the web of the world that we live in. And to get conservation work accomplished, like, sometimes there's dollars and cents behind it. Agricultural security, like, dependence on honeybees leaves farms vulnerable to impacts like, colony collapse disorder, disease, and things like that. Poor weather, like you're dependent on one species of insect to do all your pollination services. That leaves you at risk. Native bees can fill in that gap, and then in many places are filling in gaps. When it comes to their habitats and things like that, it's important from a carbon storage point of view too. Grassland habitats store carbon a lot better than a mowed lawn. Like, there's a lot of benefits to having like a pollinator garden or pollinator meadow or things like that. Biodiversity. Pollinators of bees are critical to the life history of many plants. Like they cannot be pollinated without their host species. And like if you lose species of bees to disease, like you don't know what the cascading effects are going to be, especially if it's linked to some plant that we weren't really paying attention to. Insects are an important part of the food chain and food web. Like they're the cannon fodder for most of the other organisms out there in the world. They feed a lot of things. They have intrinsic inherent value. They're living organisms. I always throw that out there because so many people don't touch about it. It's like, I always kind of like, it's like, well, I mean, they have a right to exist. They're a living organism on this planet along with the rest of us. Like, we shouldn't, we should at least be taking some care and consideration to their existence. Um, and then functional native habitats just benefit everybody. Whole host of species, like in your grasslands and meadows and things like that, just the food web, like the insects go all the way up through the birds and the mice and the rodents up through snakes and everything else, just the standard like biology 101 food web. Insects are a big part of the base of it. Agriculture pollination. I always like to kind of throw this out there, and I've had some kind of fun conversations with some of the farmers that I know and grew up with blueberries and cranberries. Is like there's a lot of research Rutgers and other people have done, and like with a lot of crops, like native bees do a significant amount of pollination. It all depends on some of the different types of varieties, open versus closed and things like that. But I always like to talk about the cranberry and blueberries, and it's like. Okay, so three-quarters of your cranberry pollination and maybe like 80% of, your blueberry pollination is done by honeybees. They pretty intensively add beehives to the farm fields to ensure they're pollinated. But like even with all of that, a significant portion of pollination is still being done by native bees. Like 25% of like your cranberries and just close to 20% of your blueberries. Like that when you multiply that over hundreds of acres, that's a lot of crop production at the end of the day. Still being done by like native bees. And I remember having some conversation with farmers doing this exact talk, and they're like, so if we do pollinator habitat around our farms, like we pretty much get free pollination. It's like so it's kind of like a simple idea, but then not, too, it's like kind of hard to wrap your head around. But it's like yeah, like that's kind of like the free services that are out there. That's like your buffer capacity for your farm. Like if you have like just blueberries and forest. You may not have as many native bees, but if you maybe manage that forest or have some pollinator fields and plantings, like all of a sudden, like you've got extra pollination going on, like free, and it's good for the environment. Carbon storage, climate change. I worked for Forest Service years ago on climate stuff, so I always love carbon cycling and things like that. Your native plants, like, everybody knows this. Big root systems, native grasslands store a lot of carbon. They're stable. And a stable carbon too, we always kind of talk about as well, is that a lot of the carbon's in the soil and grasslands versus like with forests and things like that. It's a lot of it's in the canopy and the biomass of the trees and vegetation. So it's a lot more susceptible to fire. I did a lot of fire research. Most of my life is like fire ecology and Pinelands fire ecosystems. So it's a funny thing that there's been some research looking at this of like how stable carbon is in grassland savanna ecosystem versus like forest. So it's like if you keep fire out of a forest, it certainly stores a lot of carbon. You have a catastrophic fire in the forest, it releases a lot of carbon. Versus in a grassland, you have fires go through, a lot of carbon stays stable in the soil. And there's been a lot of more recent research on that, which is kind of interesting in that, like, once again, just justifying why do we do this? It's like having flowers is nice, they look pretty, but like they're doing a lot of other stuff. Kind of like carbon stuff as well when it comes to insects and how things are linked. I love this kind of stuff. It's like when you look at the biomass and carbon storage on the planet Earth, obviously a lot of carbons in plants. But then we look at like the carbon that's covered by animals. Oh, a big percentage of it's all insects. It's like even though they're small, there's an awful lot of them out there, and they are really, really important. Every one of them plays some role. So it's just kind of fun to think about. Like you're doing a lot of good when you have a butterfly garden in your front yard. Um, so kind of getting into some of the stuff we do, how can you help? Like, like it's really cool to see this organization and how successful it is. And it's kind of fun for me to be kind of like looking to try and find some ways to work and partner together with you. I mean, it's challenging because at the end of the day, I'm only one person and I'm responsible for like all the insects in the entire state of New Jersey, which is an awful lot. Like, so it's like it's fun to like see like groups like this that are successful and be like, yeah, this is like what can we come up with? How can we do stuff? There's all these people that want to do this great work, and sometimes it's just a matter of getting like the information to the right people and finding the right partners that like multiply our efforts. Um, talking about this real quick, I always kind of like just kind of touch on this is like we get very very focused on rare species and rare species conservation, and then that gets kind of lumped up into the pollinator conservation kind of like term. So the awful lot gets lumped together in the term pollinator conservation. You wouldn't talk about mammal conservation, like, and lump all the mammals together. Um, once again, like as we've gone through my talk so far, like rare bees are specialists and dependent on like a variety of specialized things. So like standard kind of pollinator kind of management in meadows is good for bees in general, and generalist bees overall, and is good in a big way. But it's like if you're trying to focus on a rare and endangered bee, it's probably not, this is good for it. It's not going to hurt anything, but it probably not what it needs. So it kind of presents problems for us as an agency trying to practice conservation. Um, some kind of like numbers and research from like Rutgers and things like that, like kind of pointing out the obvious, like old field versus like pollinator plantings. Of course, there's a lot more native bee abundance in pollinator plantings and things like that. The error bars come into more of a importance in the next slide. But when you start looking at like the rare species and crunching the numbers of like thousands and thousands of like bee specimens and tons of survey effort in these fields, it kind of balances out for like the rare species. Now, granted, pollinator plant versus old field planting looks like it's better for rare bees and like raw numbers, but from like a error point of view and a statistics point of view, and there's quite a few other kind of studies kind of looking at this too. It's like it doesn't really mean too much for the rare ones. I mean, it's good. They get a little bump. They're obviously going to use it. It's a lot better than like a mowed lawn, but like the rare ones are specialized and they need to be looked at in their own light. Um, so how are we as a state agency trying to practice bee and pollinator conservation? So we've kind of trying to take all that information and put it into something useful, because everybody always expects the silver bullet. Always get the question of like, what's the best pollinator seed mix? I'm like, it's the state of New Jersey. We go from like the Pine Barrens, which is one thing, to Appalachian Mountains, which is something else. And then we got the Piedmont, Intercoastal Plain, an awful lot of different habitats in between. And it's like, it's really hard. It is so much of experimental. It's like, we can kind of give broad recommendations, but there's a lot of trial and effort when it comes to doing pollinator habitat work, especially if you're looking at doing it at scale and things like that. It's kind of like it's always challenging. Everybody, like, what's the best pollinator mix? And like, it all depends on where you are. Like it gets complicated quick. So we try to provide technical guidance. We've been working together with our partners in our lands management over in Parks and Forestry. Um, one thing that we do well and have the opportunity for at Fish and Wildlife is we manage a lot of real estate and we manage a lot of fields. So we have thousands of acres of fields. I think we have over 4,000 acres of fields in various, like, they're called like our agricultural fields, but they could be any number of in any different types of management. Some might be cover crops, some might be warm season grass, pollinator meadows, and things like that. But we have a ton of real estate to manage for pollinators. And like when there was a lot of a bigger push from like the government and DEP to try doing more pollinator conservation work and habitat work, it was like the first low hanging fruit is like, well, we've got thousands of acres of fields. It's not hard to plant them into, pollinators and worms eating grass instead of sorghum, like, so that's kind of like some of the stuff we started off doing. Even this slide's outdated. I gotta add some, add some more stuff to it. But, we started off like, with a small number of pollinator plantings up to doing hundreds and hundreds of acres of pollinator management and planting every year because we have we have the capability. We've got the land. We've got people that know how to manage fields and things like that. It was kind of like a straightforward, easy thing to do. And then once again, it was like changes in or agency priorities and perceptions over time. It's fish and wildlife. Like it's very much been focused on hunting and fishing and trapping and things like that. That's the basis of agency. It's the basis of how it's funded. And the interesting thing I always tell people too is like we get very little tax dollars or outside money to pay for this. Most of this is paid by like hunting and angling funds. Um, and we do it as an agency because it's like, hey, this is good for the environment. We're good land stewards, is what we should do. And it's good for like the hunting and fishing game community. And like these environments, everybody can enjoy. Anyone can go on a WAMA and look for butterflies and enjoy them. So it's just the right thing to do. And we've been expanding it as time's going on. Some of the work just converting fields over to pollinator seed mix, pretty straightforward. Invasive plants being always the war, but one of those things that we keep expanding more and more on every year. We started expanding into some other like old fields. One of the problems we have, with all the fields that we have, particularly when you get in the northern half of the state, is you all know what happens to a field when you leave it alone and you stop maintaining it and paying attention to what's invading into it. It pretty much ends up like a mass of autumn olive and honeysuckle and barberry and stiltgrass and whatever other garbage there happens to be, mugwort. So it's like a lot of our problems is like, some of the fields, with as the agency's going over time, our staffing's gone up and down, our funding's gone up and down, and during those downswings, a lot of field areas like just went out of management because we didn't have capacity, and trying to claw them back, is a challenge, and one of the things we're trying to do is get into these fields that are a real mess and make them into something better, and try and get the invasives out and restore it to natives. Um, Project we're kind of working on right now, like with our lands management staff, is about a 20-acre field down in Cape May, next to frosted elfin population. And it's like a field that used to be rotationally mowed, 4-year rotation, was beautiful. And then, equipment breakdowns, staffing losses, like all of a sudden it just goes out of rotation. At least down south, it's not like in southern New Jersey, invasive problems aren't so bad. Like it's nice to go down to Pine Barrens. I grew up in the Pine Barrens, like I didn't really know what an invasive plant problem was. And then I started working for the state and started working up North Jersey. I'm like, I took a walk in the woods today and everything that green didn't belong there, like, but this field's not really too bad from an invasive point of view, but it was converting over to cedar and Virginia pine and stuff like that. And as a project we started the past 2 weeks of like going in forestry, mowing the site, kind of restoring it back to a field. We're going to be doing baptisia, milkweed, and a variety of other plantings this spring. And then long term, we're dividing it up into 4 kind of management units and going to rotationally burn it with the Forest Fire Service. So this is just one snapshot of one little project we're doing, but like we're multiplying this across the state. And we're looking at some new kind of like funding sources to help kind of pay for some of these projects to say, hey, like we've got the state owns so much land, so much preserved. It's pretty like if we can get the money to do it, like we've got a lot of opportunity to do good for all these species. Um, One of the other projects we work together with is our State Park Service and State Forest Service and State Tree Nursery. Fish and Wildlife are really good at doing things at a big scale. 10, 20-acre fields, big forestry projects. Like we work on a scale like that. Like we don't have a lot of buildings and facilities like Parks does. Now, parks, on the other hand, they've got a lot of nature centers and offices and beaches and other things with the public. They're a great place for doing pollinator gardens and butterfly gardens. So we started a whole project together with them and the state tree nursery to grow and propagate native plants and distribute them as kit pollinator gardens to install these gardens at various parks and things. And I'll touch on this a little bit because one of the partner projects kind of thinking of working together with the Native Plant Society on is like, once again, it's very much limited by the capacity of myself to move plants around and the state forest service staff to like kind of sort them out. But we grow 5 to 6 thousand native plants a year, 20 to 30 different species, all native wildflowers or butterfly host plants. And what we do is we put them into like pollinator kits. Now, granted, we do some bulk batches of like Baptisia, wild indigo, just for frosted elfin projects. We do just bulk milkweed if people really want to do milkweed for monarchs. But the rest of them go into like pretty much like instant butterfly gardens. So we have these trays of about, 50 to 100 plants, depending on how many and what varieties. And it's pretty much, hand out a tray of plants and you can have an instant butterfly garden kind of free of charge. And there are some caveats to that and things like that where we are growing the plants we can't complete with the private nursery industry. So like we use these on state and public property for conservation projects, so it can't really be used for like landscaping and stuff. But it's, designed to be a conservation project to as we find like interested or willing partners that are interesting, and I always tell people too, is like, well, if you don't mind driving to Jackson to pick up plants, you can have whatever you want. I can only drive so many around. These have gone into pollinator gardens and plantings all over the state. And once again, like scales vary from like having like, more focused kind of garden areas to like, augmenting field plantings. A lot of times, you plant seed mixes. Like once again, we're doing a 100-acre field. I really want the Baptisia seed, the wild indigo in that seed mix to grow. And all of a sudden it doesn't germinate. It's just a roll of the dice. But if I grow plugs and tubes, I can guarantee getting that plant in there. So that's one of the things we use like these plantings for too, is like kind of targeted like augmentation. Like, well, we're going to do a pollinator seed mix in this site. It's going to be, hit and miss what's going to grow. We know that for, it's just the way it's going to be. But if we really want to make sure there's milkweed there, we really want to make sure there's like wild indigo there or some other plant, we'll do it with tubes too to augment it to make sure it gets in there. In the end of the day, looking to have a beautiful meadow that supports a variety of wildlife. I always include like the corner of my front yard in my house, like it can be built anywhere, any small spot. Like I live in Edison and Middlesex County, pretty like, urban area. And like the amount of diversity that is out in my like little pollinator garden on any given day is amazing. And it's like, you see like the mowed lawn with like mulch and some ornamental and there's like nothing there. And then you walk out and have like a nice little garden and it's just like full of life. Um, some of our kind of novel partners, we did one of these at the State Museum. Like we're talking about to them about some different project work. And like, hey, you guys got a space to do a pollinator garden? Like we've got this little kind of 10-foot wide circle by the door there that just we don't do anything with. Let's plant it there. So we did this little 10-foot circle of pollinator plants that you can see is lush and beautiful and just like loaded with life with a little bit of signage. And the funniest note of this too is like, the intangible benefits of these kind of things. So this space was like nothing. It meant nothing in the past. It just people walked past that space and went in and out of the building. Now the curator's office is up there, just kind of to the left. Now that you have this garden there, people come and sit and they'll sit there and watch the garden and they'll enjoy the garden, see what's going on. People stop and take a look because there's always something happening. There's always a flower in bloom. There's always a bee or butterfly or any number of things in there. And it's just kind of one of those amazing things. It's like that's 10 foot across. Like it's so small. It's in downtown Trenton. How would that, it's not going to make a big difference. If all of a sudden it made a difference to that place. And then how many people are now enjoying that and learning something and seeing something that they didn't before? Like, it's really interesting. Even when we built it, it was like, I didn't really expect like yeah, now there's people sit on that bench that never used to sit there before just to watch the garden. So that's kind of cool. Great community service project. I do this for like my son and daughter, both in Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. This is on the Middlesex Greenway near where I live. We've built a bunch of these with the local scouts. It's a great community service project, great educational project, great outreach. The kids love it. And it's funny, like we built this along this greenway that is very popular kind of place. Tons of people going up and down it. And it's like if you're there working on that garden, you will talk to people the entire time you're there. Everybody is like curious, interested, like this is great. We love it. This looks so wonderful. And now that it's been there for a couple of years and grown and done well, and we've kind of augmented and added some other ones, like people that have came by before see you working on it again, like, wow, this is amazing. This is wonderful compared to what it used to be. So it's really kind of cool and like relatively straightforward to do. We talked about invasive plants, like the biggest challenge is the war on invasive plants. And I've had sites where it's like you get one invasive licked and then next year some other one comes in and then something else comes in or something else changes. It's just like the endless battle. Um, Kind of trying to wrap it up so we got time to have some questions and stuff. What can you do? Like there's so much that can be done. Like Native Plant Society kind of preaching to the choir. Um, it's like a lot of details in any given site, but it can be built anywhere, which is really nice. Like if you're looking at stuff that's on a bigger scale, like it's always tough to kind of wrap your heads around like scale. Like you're doing a pollinator garden at a nature center is one thing versus I'm going to do 20 acres of fields. That's a whole nother animal. And then the other thing too is like, am I interested in like rare bees and learning more about them and focusing on some rare forest bees or some rare specialist bee versus, more general kind of approach. There's nothing wrong with any given one thing, but it's always like, pollinator management and pollinator conservation is kind of like a broad term, but then you start to get into the weeds of it a little bit, like, and it becomes more challenging. Um, you know, Basic principles, having a wide variety of nectar plant species, wide variety of host plants for butterflies, structural kind of plants for like bees to nest in. Plant natives, pretty straightforward. Structural diversity, variety in plant sizes, nesting habitats. Different size bees need different size plant stems to nest in. So the more variety it is, the better there is. Varied flowering, timing, like all these bees fly at different times throughout the season. Same thing for butterflies. You have early spring butterflies that are out March and April. Then you have things like Leonard Skipper that's out in September. And you have monarchs that might need milkweed to breed on all season long. And then you've got migrating monarchs that need late flowering plants for, filling up nectar to go to Mexico. Um, don't forget about shrubs and trees. It's interesting to have a talk about that. Like we include a variety of different shrubs with some of our pollinator kit gardens, like from elderberries to buttonbush, blueberries, silky dogwood, you know, just to include those in your garden spaces. They are important too. Even nesting habitat, a lot of times, even just bare soil, bare ground can play a role. Grasses, just stopping mowing. And tell people it's like the first thing you just kind of stop mowing and see what happens. Sometimes there's a good seed bank already. You don't have to do too much work. Avoiding the use of pesticides. I hate seeing all like the mosquito spraying and the tick spraying and all these things advertised. It's like, oh. And then herbicides. Unfortunately, for a lot of these invasives, like you have to use herbicides to control them. But it can be done carefully and selectively. They can be highly beneficial. People always ask about bee houses. I'm not too big an advocate, but a lot of people use them. The biggest thing, the story with them, they need to be maintained. They do attract it. Like, once again, we got a lot of native bees. There's also a lot of native parasitoids that also prey on bees, so the moment you put a lot of any given animal in any given one place, the thing that might eat that animal quickly finds that place. So these things just need to be kind of cleaned and maintained and rotated through. I mean, there's nothing wrong with them, but you just need the little TLC. Um, Tons of information out there, there's so much. Like you don't have to, invent a lot of stuff on your own to be able to do this work. There's a lot of it out there. And then when it comes to some of the NRCS stuff and Rutgers stuff, like there's specific like kind of planting guidelines just for New Jersey, which is very nice. It's available online and updated regularly. Um, some take home things, similar things, just changing mowing regime. I was talking about mowing regimes. We're just stopping mowing at all. Like I've always found, like even within our own government and park service and fish and wild and everything else, people love to mow and it's easy to mow, so they spend a lot of time mowing. It's like there's plenty of other things to do. And if you want to kill plants, like ID, like the invasive ones, and go out and spend the day with loppers and a spray bottle going after them instead of mowing stuff, But it's always little by little. Pollinator Gardens is a great citizen science tool. Like I've done them at like schools, churches, like, and one thing I've always found with that too is like it's a doorway. Like most times people are really hesitant when you're like, I'm going to put a pollinator garden by the school. And you're like, are there going to be bees and are people going to be stung? And then it's like, you kind of get over those hurdles and you get past the initial nervousness of it. And it's like, you don't have to mow it. You don't have to water it. You don't have to wait. Yeah, just leave it alone. Let it grow. It'll do its thing. And then all of a sudden, like you got this beautiful garden with all this life and people are like, wow, It's amazing. I'd like to make more. When can we do another one? Can you come back next year? Can we expand on this? So I've always found it to be kind of a doorway. And there's always like there's some of that hesitancy of like, I know what a mowed lawn is and I can take care of my mowed lawn. That's just makes me feel comfortable. Versus like, I'm gonna let part of it go and have it be wild. It's kind of get take the plunge. But then once you do, most people are like, wow, this is really cool. I didn't realize what was there. Public education is big, like, getting people to know and learn this stuff, opening that doorway to them because most people love this kind of stuff. They appreciate it. They're willing to support it. A lot of people just don't have the basic kind of like education or knowledge about like bees and butterflies and conservation to kind of help them open that door to them. And like you build it, they will come. I always remember planting like the first milkweed in my house in Edison and thinking, well, I mean, this is cool. Maybe a monarch will find it. And like year one, they found it. And like every year since then, there's always monarchs here every year. And there's not milkweed within half a mile of my house. It's like you build it, they will come. And so that's kind of the end of things. And I think I got time fairly well. And then, however they're going to do questions, I'll be open to questions, anything you'd like to ask. I can talk about mussels too and all the other things I tinker with, but mostly focused on bees and pollinators. And there's a whole host of things I work on. So this is only the tip of the iceberg.
I don't think we'll have time for mussels. We have a lot of questions, Robert. So I'm going to try to group them together, but I want to start with this one. What defines a bee?
So it's pretty much defined by like adaptation. This is like getting into like the technical weeds because like the moment us humans assign like categories of things, there's always exception. But it's having like adaptations for like pollination and things like that, special structures on legs or the body for like carrying and transporting pollen. So I mean, they're an insect. They have 6 legs. They're very similar to flies and wasps and things like that. Your wasps are like predatory. They're feeding on like other insects and other things. Although they do visit plants and things like that and will do pollination, they don't really have like structures for transporting pollen. So like the kind of I guess the most broad like I'm sure I could look up a textbook definition that might do better than just answering on the fly. It's a bee because it's a bee, but it's mostly related to having like pollen transporting structures and things like that on the legs, on the body, and things like that to kind of separate them from the other insects. Because a lot of the other insects will do some pollination, but that's not like their primary purpose in life. They'll kind of take advantage of it or utilize it in some way, but it's like it's not the keystone of what they're doing. Wasps are going hunting insects and provisioning their young with like other insects and things like that, versus a bee is provisioning with pollen or nectar or other resources it's collecting.
Awesome. What's happening in this picture, Robert?
I always put that up there because it's always kind of fun and it's good to generate questions. Getting into biodiversity and different species and stuff like that. It is a robber fly that is a bumblebee mimic that is preying on a bumblebee. So
Oh,
they're really cool, and it's actually a fly. And they kind of sit and it's funny because it's shaped like a bumblebee, but when they're sitting, they kind of sit like a fly. So you'll see, and you're like, wait a minute, oh yeah, there you are. I know what you're up to. But yeah, they're robber flies that like have mimicry of bumblebees, which is kind of cool.
awesome. And speaking of types of bees, the Coletus bradleyi, where in New Jersey can you see them?
That's a pine barren specialist, like in like true pine plains and pine barrens, and
Okay.
it's like down like in Ocean County, Broward County, like the Pygmy Plains, like that area. And
Mhm.
it's one of those things too. We don't really know much about it. Like so many of these bees have been kind of collected and ID'd, so it becomes a challenge. Like, because where do you go to collect bees when you're out there like surveying for bees on flowers? But where did it come from? Where's its nest and things like that? Like those questions are hard to answer. And it's one of those ones we know very little about it, other than the fact that we managed to collect it a couple random times. It's only found there. It can be identified. But beyond that, like, there's a lot to be learned. So like so many of these insects present like research opportunities. And, and it's in like a New Jersey, in a state like New Jersey that has so many pressures on the environment, like you hate to have one of these wink out before you can even have some idea of what to do about to prevent that from happening.
Absolutely. And what's the most common native bee in New Jersey?
Ooh, I have no idea the answer to that question. That's a good one. I don't know, to tell you the truth. It probably varies by region too. Because
Hmm.
like once again, like like the rusty patch bumblebee used to be the most common bee in the Pinelands of South Jersey. It was less common other places, but it turned up there. But like it used to
Yeah.
be like the bumblebee down there, and like some other species of bumblebee have kind of like, I don't know if the term would be filled his role, but are still there and didn't. But yeah, I don't know what the single most common species would be. There's
Hmm.
definitely some generalists that are found everywhere. I don't know. It's a good question. I'll have to look into that. It's interesting too with like the crunching of numbers is like the one thing is like it'll drive you nuts. There's 300 some species, so there's plenty of them there to drive you crazy. There were species where Rutgers would like, some of their survey efforts would be like, we find them throughout the state, but we'll never find one or two everywhere. We never find a ton of them. And then there are some species where it's like, oh, well, there's one species I remember is down at Cape May. Yeah, they're only in one place in Cape May, but there's hundreds of them there. Like it was like there's like some of that stuff going on where it's like, it's kind of hard to answer the question of most common bee. But it's
Right.
interesting. I'm gonna have to ask that question. What's the one that's most common, like in numbers and in distribution?
Yeah. Yeah. Get back to us on that one. That would be a curious one.
Yeah.
Um, some technical things. What is WMA? What do they
Oh,
do?
sorry. Sorry. Any other ones or just that one?
Well, there's more about your slide. So you showed a biomass graphic. We'd love to know where you got that. And
Oh,
way back in the beginning, you had the New Jersey map with the purple and yellow dots on it. There were people wondering, why are they yellow? Why are they purple? Why aren't they dispersed?
okay. So I'll answer those in various order. Like the different colored dots are all kind of grouped by survey efforts and projects and things like that. So it's not really anything too specific other than like that's just like whatever project or survey Rutgers happen to be on. And then like I mentioned kind of like sampling bias. It's like it's hard because you can't survey everywhere's equally. Like in a perfect world, we'd evenly distribute like bee sampling across the state of New Jersey by ecosystems, location stuff. It'd just be very costly. So some of it's just like where they were doing research for whatever. When it comes to a lot of bee survey efforts too, it's very hard to focus on like just trying to find a bee. A lot of it involves like just kind of like either bulk sweep netting, using bowls that are baited traps. Like unfortunately, like you have to kill the bees to be able to identify them. Like it's like one of those things. It's like it's a huge trade-off because sometimes we're working in these rare habitats of like we want to find out what's here, but we don't want to kill too many things too. So like trying to find that kind of in between. And so like your sample efforts aren't very focused. So like you're getting everything in a given area and then sorting it out later. So you can't really focus on one thing or the other. So like those survey efforts might be related to like, I don't know, like cantaloupe farming or something like that, some agricultural project. So they're out there doing surveys on farms for whatever project they're on, but they're collecting all the bees and identifying them all. So maybe they're only focused on answering one question, but they're still collecting all the data.
Right.
So you're getting all this secondary data. So like the colored dots are various research projects, and I think if I remember right, the black ones were kind of like where they were trying to randomly kind of sample in between to try and hit some different habitats and things. So answers that question. Um,
WMA.
WAMO. My apologies. Like the government loves acronyms. Wildlife Management Area.
Oh,
So when it comes to the state, like everybody kind of like assumes like all the state's land are owned and managed by the same agency, but like wildlife, fish and wildlife manages all of the wildlife management areas. It's just the way they divide up like the lands and who's taking care of them. Parks and forestry manage all the parks and forests. We manage the WAMAs. There's slightly different like user kind of focuses. Like, our WAMAs are focused more on hunting and fishing and providing hunting fishing opportunities. We're not providing a beach for you to swim at. Like it's just, the way it's, managed and things like that. And then like the biodiversity, like the biomass slide, it was something I found online. I was trying to find some good ones. It wasn't really anything. I think I included a link on it because it's like, people are going to ask. It was kind of a good one. Like I like carbon stuff. And I was just
yeah.
trying to find some infographic that would kind of
Yeah,
like,
there it is.
yeah, biomass distribution on Earth. It was a research paper with the link kind of there below. Um, you could probably
Oh,
split that like numbers out any number of different ways, and I'm sure that I can.
there it is, HTTPS. Everybody who had that question, you want to take a picture? Well, he's kind enough to have it up. I think the link is there below the title of it. Um,
It
Okay.
was a neat kind of infographic to kind of, it's like, the biomass on the earth. It's like,
Yeah,
it's
it's
kind of a
very
big
cool.
nebulous thing, but it kind of gave like a good like snapshot because it's like you kind of think about how these things and how they're interconnected, but it's kind of hard to wrap your head around it. But it gave a kind of nice image of like, where is all the carbon on the or on the face
That
of the
is
earth?
so.
Like here, there it is, like, and
Um,
insects and plants are important for that.
so two things I just want you to keep in mind. One is a lot of people want to know what are the plants for these specialist bees, because you don't want to just go build a pollinator garden with generalist bee plants in mind. Is there a list of the specialist bees and the plants that support them?
To a certain extent, yes. And then there's an awful lot of blanks in that list too. So we have a
Okay.
lot of rare bees and we just know they're uncommon due to our surveys and sampling effort. But as to why that is, maybe we're just not surveying the right places. When it comes to like the specialists, like a lot of them are linked to some of those things I mentioned along the way of like things like willows and dogwoods, flowering trees and shrubs.
Okay.
Blueberries and cranberries are also biggies.
So
Um,
keystone, some of the keystone plants also support the specialists.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're relatively common plants. It's not like it's a rare
Right.
plant. Yeah, I guess we could get into like some of the rare. I'd have to go dig through like the data because there's a lot of them we just don't know. But
Right.
like we have a lot of information together, and Rutgers has been like expanding on it as time's going on too. But yeah, like we have some tables information. So like a lot of it be really specific to like where you are. Like, and then we could kind of like we're trying to get this a little bit more publicly available and like. There is the big pollinator lab ran through USGS down, and I'll have to send that link. That they're doing a lot of research on this stuff too. I'll have to get the information for that because they're a neat resource as well. So we have a lot of this kind of like we've got some of that information. It's just not an easy like public format because it's like 300 some species and some Excel tables and other stuff. And as time goes on and we're researching stuff, we're kind of filling in blanks in the table as best we can.
Okay. And someone actually in the Q&A offered Heather Holmes' book. She features a lot of specialist bees and the native plants to support them. I have that book. It's phenomenal. You'll certainly get to know your bees, or you'll be overwhelmed by all the variety. Um, and so bioacoustics, they've got a couple people talking about music therapy and bioacoustics. Are they being used in any way to help with ID or to help with the effort to save these bees?
Not that I'm aware of, and it's not something I'm overly familiar with either. Is that for like monitoring identification based on the sounds generated by the
Yeah.
bees?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's like we've not done anything with that. Like I've heard of it, but like I'm not familiar with it. Like it's just not something I've delved into yet, but I'm always learning something new. So I knew
And
very little about fireflies until 2 years ago, and then took the deep dive on that. So it's like, always learning something new.
yeah, Robert, how about iNaturalist? Do you use that in any way in your studies, or do you use it to help with research?
We just are starting to use it more. And it's a good question because it's one of those things that I would say is kind of gotten out ahead of the government, I would say, in the way we manage data and do research. So we use it for screening, and like I use it particularly for, looking for rare species and records. Like with a lot of the bees, like a lot of the IDs are like, most of the, experts are going to be like, yeah, you can't do it from a photo, but like it's helpful in that like if it even if you're not 100% certain of the ID of something, I use it for butterflies, and I can go through there and find errors all day long, and then occasionally I'm like, oh wow, sweet, somebody found one and they didn't report it to me in any other way. um but it does help like focus survey effort because it's like, even if you can't like 100% like ID it from the photo, but you're like, there's a pretty good chance of it. Now you can target like a survey effort to that location.
Yep.
So we've been actually starting to look into pulling some data out of that in different ways, like mostly just very species focused kind of stuff. Or sometimes, a lot of times, it's more for the common species that people don't report to us. And I'll just quick, try not to bore you too much with how our detail and stuff works for the government. A lot of the species that we work on, like particularly butterflies and dragonflies, rusty patch bumblebee is a federally listed species and by default a state listed and protected species. So there's a good example here. So that species is legally protected. If someone were to find a population of it, report it to us, we would be able to provide like some form of legal protection at the site, the habitat. It'd be on our radar to like not mow the field, fill in the blanks. The thing is, though, things that have legal protection have a lot of rules, regulations, and things related to them. So for us to be able to use the data, it has to be reported officially through. I should put this in here because it's like a very generic kind of slug. I had a slide because it's wildlife tracker. So if you search New Jersey wildlife tracker, it's our sighting reporting application. It's very much like iNaturalist, but it comes directly to us. It has different categories and things like that. The reason I mention it is because we have an internal vetting process where like any reports that come through Wildlife Tracker are vetted. We put identifying information with them. So, like, if I get a bee that's pollinating some flower, it might be like a nectarine or pollinating kind of like identifier on it, in that it's in like a pollinator. It's more like it's in a flower field, nectarine. So it's a nectarine observation. That bee's nectaring in a habitat that it needs to get nectar. Versus like I found a, rusty patch bumblebee nest in the forest underneath of this, clump of pile of brush. That's like a breeding, nesting kind of habitat record. So that's how we kind of identify stuff. There's locational certainty. It has to be signed off. But because these things have legal ramifications, it has to go through a more kind of like, more thorough process of review and approval. Because like once that data goes into like our system is approved and mapped, like it's used and has regulatory impacts over time. So like I tell people it's like, there's like data that's kind of helpful for me to like target surveys, find out stuff. But then it's like if it's really important to you, or it's important to us, or it's like you once like it's some habitat that should be protected, or you don't want us doing something negative to it, it kind of has to go through this other process because it has a whole kind of vetting, quality control kind of aspect to it. Because it has to be accurate, it has to be like a correct ID. There's a lot of stuff because all of a sudden somebody wants to put in some subdivision and we're holding to them to some regulatory standard, like it's got to hold up in court. So that's where like iNaturalist, people are like, oh, I put in iNaturalist. Can you look at it? It's like, I can, but then it only helps me so far. And even if I go there and I don't see it, like, I can't use it. So it's kind of like a little dive into how our data works and the madness of the government, but it works in that way. And it kind of, that's the legal side of it.
Oh, and I'm sure there's a lot of it. A lot of
Hell yeah,
the side of it you have to keep in mind.
that's what people think my job is, and then there's like my real work sitting at my computer writing like reports and stuff.
So Robert, it's 8:15, so I just want to ask, can you share your contact information right now before you go? We have several people who have big properties that would love to talk to you a little bit about some of the strategies that you're using. We have somebody who works for Extension, and they're curious how DEP and Extension could work together. So if you could share your contact information, that will help some of the folks that have more specific questions that we're running out of time to ask.
Yeah. I'm just trying to drop it in the chat. Yeah, anybody can shoot me an email. There's a ton of things available, especially if you're like a private landowner. Um, there's a lot of stuff like U.S. Fish and Wildlife still doing a lot of stuff through partners. There's a lot of Department of Ag stuff. Like there's various programs and projects. Like with us, a lot of our money is just the way it is. Like we can only work on state property or public property. We don't do private land stuff. I just dropped my email in there. That's the best way to get in touch with me.
Okay. Those of you
Cooperative
aren't,
extent.
can I just say, for those of you who aren't on chat, it's Robert dot Somes, SOMES, at dep.nj.gov. So hopefully you all can connect. And then
Yeah.
how do we get the pollinator kits, and who are they available for? How do we learn the rules and how to get them?
Yeah, so a couple things. I've worked with Extension at a couple different times with different people in different ways. It all depends on like what capacities and interests. Like there's always opportunity to do more and work together. It's mostly like at the end of the day I'm like one person, so it's like however much like I can work together with someone on something and we do it. So we try to work with Extension. There's always opportunity to do more. Very site project kind of specific. Private lands, we can provide technical guidance, and there's a lot of programs out there you can kind of direct you to. When it comes to like the pollinator kits, it's like one of those things too. There's always been an opportunity to try and like partner with someone to help kind of like coordinate and move things from A to B. So like when it comes to stipulations, it's just like they have to be for like public property, like, so like state, county, municipal kind of projects. So it can be like a pollinator garden at a town hall and things like that. Because there's some rules and regulations related to like our state tree nursery and that like they do sell products, but they can't compete with private nursery stuff by law. So like whatever product they produce for sale can't be like competitive with private nurseries. And like anything like this, like we can't sell flowers because like nurseries sell flowers and be considered to be like unfair and uncompetitive with like private stuff. So like we use it just for conservation purposes. So
Okay.
if people have projects, most of it's just reaching out to me, and it's kind of like one of those things that's funny too, is like if people are willing, if they got a project and they reach out to me and say, "Hey, I've got this project on like this park up here, and we'd like to have some plants, and I can get it the plants to you," like. Yeah, sure thing. We're only limited by like however much production we have in any given year. It's always people always want to know how much and when, and it's like we don't know till everything starts growing. And like last year was so unusual. We planted everything in the greenhouses in March, and it like wasn't ready to go out till like well into June because everything grew so slow with all the rain and clouds and stuff. Normally, plant stuff in March and it's ready to rock like the end of April, and like we kept going down there, and all the plants were like just got to like that and just stopped growing. It's like, and also by the time we were distributing kits, it was like it was late in the season. But yeah, it's kind of coordinated through me, and like I kind of look at like maybe the Native Plant Society, like it's like if they have a county or people like that, like if you've got a network of people that like want to do projects, like the challenge is like there's all these potential projects out there, and then
Right.
we can grow a lot of plants. It's to getting them from point A to point B and like kind of connecting the dots and communicating. So like that's something we can talk more of offline. Like if there's like the county could be like the key point to then reach out to me, like or some person
And we
that's
have
like,
the
hey,
chapters, yeah, and we have all our chapters across the state too.
yeah, so it's like, just kind of reaching out to me. Like I'm kind of the one coordinating it all. Like there's always been like so many things. Like we could, we grow 5 to 6 thousand plants a year, divided by 50 to 100, give or take, produces a lot of kits that go all over the place. Like we could grow 10 to 20,000, but the capacity of moving them around would be limiting. But like it wouldn't be hard for us to do it. It's just always one of those things if we ever could get like the right thing of like, hey, we could really move this stuff out and put it in the ground. Like we can make more planes so we know what to deal with. It's kind of funny.
Well, thank you so much, Robert. This was awesome. You covered a lot of content in a short time, tons of questions. Hopefully, we satisfied the audience that asked them. We do our best, but at every Wednesday webinar, we do have to say goodnight. So thank you very much. Thank you to everybody who's stayed with us through the whole thing. We really, really appreciate your engagement and your care. And if you're not a member, please join so you get all the information and don't miss an event. Thank you. Good
Thank
night.
you for having me.
You're so welcome.
Night all.
Good
Good
night.
night.